All right, everybody, welcome to the FITSNews studios, another edition of your Week in Review. I am Will Folks, founding editor, owner of FITSNews.com. We're glad you joined us today. A ton of stories to cover. We've got missing monkeys in the South Carolina Lowcountry, fallout from the presidential election, and a big update on one of the biggest true crime stories we've ever covered, the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga. All that and more is heading your way on the Week in Review. So for those of you new to the show, we cover a ton of politics here at FITSNews. We cover a ton of true crime stories, including one we're going to get to here in a minute. But this week, the stories have been all about the animal kingdom. We've had a Bigfoot sighting, escaped emus, but the story that's been driving national headlines involves 43 missing rhesus macaque monkeys from a research facility in Yemassee, South Carolina. Our Jen Wood has been on this story from the very beginning. Jen, tell us what's happening on the ground in the South Carolina Lowcountry related to these missing monkeys.
So overnight, November 6th, 43 rhesus macaques escaped from the research facility. Apparently, the one of the caretakers, when they were putting them away for the night, missed a latch. And, I think we all know monkeys are very crafty, very creative, and they managed to have a coup and all get out. So they have been working on capturing these monkeys since November 6th. There are, as of this morning, still 8 loose. They are kind of trying to lure them into humane traps using peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
Well, that would get me for sure. But these are all female monkeys, correct? All
female monkeys. They're all younger, according to the CEO of the facility. And the younger monkeys are, they're not aggressive. They're more laid back.
So the escape happens there. They didn't get very far. Apparently there was a tree line near this facility, which again, for those of you unfamiliar with the South Carolina Lowcountry, very flat, very sprawling area, lots of forest, lots of farmland. But these monkeys were apparently in a wooded area very close to the facility. So it wasn't like you saw in a lot of media reports, monkeys running wild throughout the state. They stayed pretty close to this lab. Is that correct, Jen?
Yeah, they stayed nearby. So in May we had macaque in Walterboro escape Bradley, and on the local social media pages there were sightings of Bradley all over town. And we're not getting that with these monkeys. They've stayed close to the facility, and they've stayed primarily in a group.
Right. Now this outbreak, this escape, caused quite a bit of political consternation. There was one of the local elected officials down there, Nancy Mace, a name that is probably familiar to a lot of folks in our audience, not only here in South Carolina, but nationally as well. Nancy Mace was not happy about this escape and issued a very blunt statement. I want to read it real quick here. Coming in hot, Nancy Mace. For years, Alpha Genesis has racked up federal contracts and taxpayer dollars while consistently violating animal welfare laws and exposing the public to dangerous escapes. Now, she said that the National Institutes of Health, which obviously made a lot of news back in COVID, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture need to step up and ensure South Carolinians don't bear the risk of this lab's negligence. So pretty stern language there from Nancy Mace. But Jen, you've done some research into this facility and its impact on the local economy there. It's kind of a big deal for the folks down there in Colleton County. Is that correct?
It's a huge deal. It's actually Hampton and Beaufort County where they provide all of their jobs.
Yeah, that's right.
It is in an area that, especially Hampton County, that is desperately in need of, jobs for its residents. It's a huge part of the economy there. The company currently has 250 employees. 160 of those employees are in Yemassee. That is 10% of the population of Yemassee.
Oh, wow.
And the economic impact to the region is over $128 million annually. So yeah, it's a huge part of the economy there. And, I know there's a lot of debate over testing on monkeys, but these monkeys were being tested for vaccine research.
Correct. And obviously the rhesus macaque, I always thought it was rhesus from the Iliad, a very minor character in the Iliad, but apparently the French uh, naturalist who discovered the monkeys says that that's not what it stands for. It doesn't stand for anything. But the rhesus macaque is an animal, not only, as you mentioned, instrumental in these vaccines, whether it's polio, smallpox, been involved in some of the recent AIDS research. Um, and again, you were telling me something I didn't know, Jen, about the RH in the blood that we always talk about. Is that from these monkeys?
Yeah, so yeah, the Rh factor in our blood. So, when you say A positive, A negative, that came from research on the blood of rhesus monkeys, and they've named it after rhesus. I mean, it's the rhesus factor.
Wow, that's awesome. Also, didn't know this before diving into this story, but these monkeys were also heroes, early heroes of the American space program. Albert 1 and Albert 2 were among the first primates ever launched on American rockets into space, and this Albert 2 actually made it into outer space. They did not survive those flights, unfortunately. It was Sam, the rhesus monkey, in 1959 that made the first flight on one of the Mercury capsules, which would later carry Alan Shepard, John Glenn, all those Mercury 7 astronauts, and paved the way for America's landing on the moon years later in 1969. So obviously they played a important role not only on the disease front, fighting diseases, Jen, but also space exploration and the race to the moon. So very interesting stuff. But as we look at this section, though, Jen, and we think about the implications here, obviously the story went crazy. It was all over the news, national news, not necessarily in the best way for South Carolina again. But Mace's point and her arguments really carried a lot of sway with folks who believe that this testing is cruel, that it's inhumane. What are your thoughts on that as we shift a little bit into the political side of this and preparing to talk to Dylan about what's happening nationally on the political front? What do you think about Mace's take on this? Do you think she's on the mark, off the mark?
I mean, yeah, this is a substantial escape from a facility housing animals used for testing. I They're needed. I mean, they're needed to test medicines, vaccines. The other option. I mean, there's just not a lot of good options other than that. I mean, we can't test them on people. So yeah, I mean, I'm an animal lover, but the reality is they're a crucial part of the scientific process.
Yeah, and I was actually told, Jen, you were secretly going to get one of these for me for Christmas. Is that correct? Heard a
The
rumor?
second those things got out, I was texting everybody I knew in Hampton. I was like, listen, just get me one. You don't have to tell anybody. I won't tell anybody. I'm gonna dress it up, put a diaper on it, put a bow on it, and just give it to Will for Christmas. It's perfect. Nobody's even gonna notice something else in his house.
Well, Jen, there are nine still free. I am counting on you this Christmas. Don't disappoint me. Jen,
I've got your back, man.
thanks for your work on this story, Jen. Keep us posted on the latest from Yemassee, South Carolina. And by the way, we're going to get into some Murdoch stuff in a minute. But for our audience that is familiar with the true crime universe here in South Carolina, worth noting the law enforcement officer leading this search, one of the members of the Murdoch Mafia down there in the Low Country, Greg Alexander, a very close friend of Alec Murdoch, the Murdoch family. He was one of the guys that was very close to the family as that whole crime saga unfolded. Ironically, he is the one leading the search for the missing macaques. But we're going to deal with the Murdoch segment here in a bit. But before we get there, it was a huge week in the national political front. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump filling out his cabinet, dealing with some serious economic headwinds, and of course, in the aftermath of his election, Trump derangement syndrome in full effect, including here in bright red South Carolina. I'm going to bring our Dylan Nolan in now to talk about the latest developments on the political front. All right, so Dylan, obviously a big week as we adjust to the president-elect status of former President Donald Trump, about to take office here in a few months, but rapidly moving to assemble his cabinet, a flurry of appointments over the last few days. I mean, is this guy putting together a cabinet faster than anybody in history? Have we ever seen anything like this?
I don't pretend to know how fast every U.S. president has ever named their cabinet, but it's certainly faster than his last administration, which I think, just from a media relations perspective, is definitely a more intelligent approach. if you remember when he was naming his first cabinet, he would kind of drip them out over the course of months, and each person would just have a brutal, like, weak media cycle about them. So doing what he's been doing, releasing 2 or 3 a day, means that they can only get so many blows in before he releases the next person.
Some big names, obviously, on Trump's appointment list. Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are head of a new Department of Government Efficiency. A lot of excitement about that. We've also got Tulsi Gabbard, head of National Intelligence, which is ironic because this is the same group that actually put her on a terror watch list, wouldn't let her fly on an airplane in America. She's now going to be running that agency. Robert F. Kennedy appointed his health czar. We've got a border czar in there. Just a ton of high-profile appointments. Obviously, the most controversial, Matt Gaetz, his nominee for Attorney General. That's got a lot of folks up in arms, and a few Republicans already starting to voice some dissent
Perhaps
there.
some South Carolina Republicans. We'll have to see how Lindsey Graham weighs in on this one.
Definitely. Well, that actually leads me to the first real question I want to ask you. Trump won the popular vote as a Republican for the first time since 2004, first time that's happened in 20 years. Won a electoral mandate, I think we can all agree, by winning all 7 of the swing states. Yet the MAGA candidate for Senate Majority Leader not only didn't win, didn't even make it past the first ballot, and a senator who has been opposed to Trump in the past, vocally so, in fact said he should have dropped out of the race when he first ran, has been installed as Senate Majority Leader. How does this impact the MAGA agenda, Dylan?
I think we're going to see how this impacts the MAGA agenda based off of how he acts. Obviously, he said what he said in the past, but he's also verbally committed at this point to going along with the Trump agenda and to putting his appointees in a timely fashion. So words are words. Politicians often go back on what they're saying, but I think it's going to come down to now seeing how he acts. What does he do?
I mean, Dylan, what's the big deal with these appointment battles? I mean, my view is you win the election, you win the election. You can appoint whoever you want to fill these posts. I mean, you want to put a gardening hose in charge of the Department of Environmental Protection, you can do that. I mean, in fact, I would argue in some of these positions, inanimate objects would probably fare better than some of the people that have been appointed in the past. What's the big deal? Why can't presidents just install who they want?
I don't know if you've ever heard of this concept. It's called checks and balances, where the 3 branches of our government all hold power over each other that they can exercise to limit the actions of the other branches.
Yeah, and that's fair enough, and I understand that as it relates to, budget vetoes and things of that nature. But picking your staff, I mean, it seems a little overreach. But anyway, let me ask you about some other changes Trump is impacting. This one was interesting. Rearranging the press briefing room, and this comes on the heels of the announcement of a major lawsuit. Trump is suing multiple mainstream media outlets for billions of dollars for what he calls organized institutional libel during the last campaign. But CBS, New York Times, on the receiving end of those legal actions. But now we've got Trump saying he's going to put some new blood in the press briefing room. What are your thoughts on this, Dylan?
The new media is where the eyeballs are going. It's where the attention is going. If you look at MSNBC, CNN, these are networks that during Trump's first administration were propelled to astronomical success because folks were tuning in for their coverage of his administration. You look after the election, they're now both significantly dropping in their ratings, which is showing that people aren't turning to cable news anymore for their coverage. And of course, they should still have places in the briefing room, but I think it's completely appropriate to be bringing in some of this new media when we're seeing unprecedented levels of attention on X and similar platforms.
Yeah, where the eyeballs are. I mean, once again, Trump sort of being ahead of the game, ahead of the curve on that front.
I think, the fact that everyone's debating whether Harris should have won on Joe Rogan is telling about the power of podcasts. Nobody's talking about whether Trump missed out by not going on SNL.
Very true. Let me ask you this question. Dylan, we've argued on this show before about why Trump won, and I think the point I've consistently made and the point I tried to make in formulating my election map the night of the election was that voters felt better off 4 years ago than they did right now when they voted, and that they trust Trump over the next 4 years to return them to that sort of more prosperous state. But Trump's got some headwinds here. We saw inflation numbers that were released just this past week. 2 of the leading indicators, the consumer price index, the producer price index, both of those are moving back up for the first time since September of 2022. They're also both above 3% if you drill into the core CPI and PPI, above 3% for the first time since April of 2023. So inflation heading back in the wrong direction and could be getting even worse based on some moves by the Fed. Is Trump inheriting a ticking time bomb on the economy?
He definitely is inheriting a ticking time bomb. Folks that are following the interest rates, folks that are following the bond yield curve, have been putting up alarm bells here for months, and and this is something that whether Harris won, whether Trump won, it was likely to come to a head in the next 4 years. And just like you say, the macroeconomic environment made this election very difficult for Democrats. I think it's poised to make this coming 2028 cycle very difficult for Republicans. It's of course possible that there could be an economic downturn early in Trump's administration that could be successfully addressed by the time voters go to the polls. But the reality is that we've been on an unprecedented bull run, a roaring 20s of our own. And, folks with any memory of the Great Depression know that those massive bull runs can come to a disastrous head. And I think that could be something that we're in for here.
So you talked about the bonds. You talked about obviously we've got debt bombs hanging out there, a $36 trillion debt with interest payments now poised to eclipse $1 trillion a year. That's money that can't be spent on tax cuts or essential services. Dylan, any other factors we should look at as we address this potential ticking time bomb? I mean, what could set it off, and what would be the ripple effects of it detonating?
The ripple effects of it detonating could be a lot of home foreclosures, as we saw last time, but also commercial office space is one of the most overvalued assets right now. People were paying a ton of money for these commercial properties back when the market was booming, back when cash was cheap prior to COVID. And then, of course, a lot of people worked from home, which tanked the value of these office buildings. And a lot of businesses and government agencies that were leasing these buildings still haven't had all of their employees return to working in the buildings. So the values have never recovered. Which means that there's a ton of debt on balance sheets because these office buildings, it's not like your house, they go for tens of millions of dollars. So there's going to be big baths taken in both the residential and commercial real estate markets. And then we're also going to see corrections on stock prices for some of these firms that in the era of cheap money have been pumping their stock prices just by stock buybacks, but not by actually generating more value for the firm.
Enron style accounting.
Well, I don't know that it's fraudulent, but it's just a macroeconomic environment that's not conducive to long-term success.
Dylan, you're talking about these economic issues. Obviously, the mainstream narrative pushing back against Trump, they say his tariffs are only going to exacerbate the price issues. They say his tax cuts are only going to exacerbate the debt issues. They say that his deportation, mass deportation, if that indeed happens, is only going to exacerbate the housing crunch, the housing shortage. Obviously, all these outlets are singing off the same sheet of music because they're repeating those same talking points over and over again. But what is Trump going to do to battle that potential ticking time bomb?
I mean, let's work back to front. I don't really understand how anybody could logically argue that removing millions of people from our country would not alleviate a housing problem. I mean, you're just going to have the same amount of supply and less demand. This is like Econ 101. So anybody who's making that claim is just stupid. The tariff thing, I think, has a lot more legitimacy to it because, I mean, if you're working in the globalist economic model where wherever you can get the good for the cheapest in the world is where you buy it from, okay, anything other than that is going to be more expensive. That being said, I covered this Trump rally in Mint Hill, North Carolina that was at a PEX plumbing factory that prior to the first Trump administration was just importing stuff from China, but now they're employing hundreds of people to manufacture these plumbing fittings here in America. So the tariff thing is complicated because it might make the price of PEX piping go up a couple of dollars, but also it's injecting huge amounts of money into these communities that manufacture it by making those jobs right here in America, not somewhere abroad.
But are we trying to unring a bell that's been rung? I mean, I go back to I was a kid when NAFTA came into being, and certainly everybody looking back on that now would be like, why in the hell did we do that? But can you unring the bell at this point?
No, I don't think you can completely unring the bell, and I don't think that anybody with a long-term strategic vision wants to completely unring the bell and go back to making everything in America. However, we're looking at a world where America's military hegemony is rapidly eroding. That's just reality. A lot of people in our foreign policy establishment haven't accepted that yet, but a sober look at the world, that is just the way that things are headed. And that means that making things that are essential for our national security, whether that be computers, whether that be the things that go into our vehicles, the things that go into our military, the things that go into our healthcare field, it seems very dangerous to be making those on the other side of the world. Now, to make it in Mexico, where it can reach America on our continent, to make it in Canada, that seems a lot more reasonable. And, the economic protectionist side of things says, well, I want to make it in America. But the the protectionist who's focused on the changing geopolitical landscape and the idea that we don't want to be making things that we need for our nation in countries which might be hostile to us in 5, 10 years, that's kind of a different story.
Well, I'm sure a lot of the never Trumpers and Trump derangement folks have been very focused on protectionism and geopolitics. Not. Uh, Let me ask you though, the never Trump crowd has been ramping up a bit. There's been a slew of Facebook posts. One guy apparently killed himself and his family in the aftermath of the election. There was a incident of that. We've got protests all over the place. Trump derangement still very much in effect is basically what I'm saying. And even here in South Carolina, a bright red state, we've seen academia respond as academia typically responds in situations like this. There's a professor here at the University of South Carolina who posted some controversial comments. In fact, we'll pull them up real here, talking about how Trump voters are basically dumb and they're ruining the country. Is that the gist of it here, Dylan?
Yeah, and I saw a really interesting take from somebody on X who responded with like, "This is why you lost the election." And I do think that condescension in politics is not usually very useful. If you think about the Barack Obama's bitter clingers comment, if you think about Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment, if you think about Joe Biden's garbage comment, it's kind of similar along those lines of it's one thing to be angry at somebody and to disagree with somebody, and it's another thing to just think that nothing that they say will ever be worthwhile and that they're like completely less than you. And that's kind of the attitude that was portrayed by these comments, which I think represents a larger problem on the left.
Yeah, there is a reason why educated people vote blue. What we're seeing is the uneducated population of America holding the rest of the country hostage. That is,
That's rough.
yeah. Now, you and I have had some disagreements, though, about what to be done about this higher ed woke industrial complex, and I'll agree it's all coming from the higher ed. I mean, this is the origin, although unfortunately now we're increasingly seeing it in K through 12. Even here in South Carolina, we've got woke indoctrination, the teacher of the year here 2 years ago, straight out of the woke culture. But Dylan, I've argued we should just privatize higher ed completely, get government out of the business of subsidizing any of this. You got a different view, don't you?
Yeah, I think you're going to be arguing that for a long time because I've never seen that actually happen. But I think that if you look at states like Florida, what Ron DeSantis has done with the colleges there, if folks aren't familiar, what he's basically done is appointed board members who are not ideological leftists, who have implemented policies which have encouraged a lot of the faculty like this, who are naked ideologues who use their positions at these academic institutions to advance their quite polarizing and perhaps societally unhealthy ideologies. He's encouraged them to move elsewhere because the educational institutions are no longer open to that.
Well, as a son of a college professor, a guy who spent 44 years at the University of South Carolina teaching international business, certainly I believe that there is a place for core subject matter. You're a business school grad. You weren't learning woke orthodoxy, or for that matter, anti-woke orthodoxy when
I
you
was
were
learning
getting
accounting.
Yeah, exactly. And I go back to this in K through 12 too. You've got things, reading, writing, arithmetic. Teach kids, these things, not 8,000 pronouns and at the college level degrees on transsexual Sanskrit. That's my argument. Is let's focus on these core capabilities. And I'm a libertarian, man. I mean, I've got a strong bent that government should do very few things and do those few things well. And I've never believed higher ed was one of those core functions. Now, I believe that K through 12, I think there's got to be, as part of a social safety net, some guarantee of K through 12 education. I'm okay with that. I've just never believed higher ed is a core function of government, but you disagree?
I might agree with you in concept, but while that's fine to prattle away on the keyboard with those beliefs, I've never seen that actually implemented in the world. And at a certain point in time, you can go on for another couple of decades writing that higher ed should be privatized, but I'm looking at this model that we see that works, that we could be implementing in this state tomorrow if there was the political will to do it.
Let's talk about that political will, because you covered a press conference this week, and we're going to shift our focus here a little bit to politics here in the state of South Carolina. But you went to a press conference this week where the State Freedom Caucus unveiled their agenda. The South Carolina House Republican establishment has also unveiled their agenda. Senators meeting later this month to discuss their plans for the upcoming session. Dylan, South Carolina has a massive Republican supermajority in both the House and the Senate, which is where the real power is here. All of our statewide constitutional officers Republicans. We've got Republicans in 6 of 7 congressional districts, both U.S. Senate seats. It is a red state, but we increasingly see a lack of conservative governance. And I think you would argue maybe Henry McMaster on this higher ed front is not.
Yeah, I mean, certainly McMaster, if folks don't know, has an important role in appointing who ends up on the board at these institutions. And that's why a guy like DeSantis, who used that role actively trying to prevent political ideologues from getting faculty positions, was able to do that. And that's something that McMaster, if he chose to go that path, could be doing. But he's kind of an empty suit.
Yeah. Well, his empty suit is going to be done at the end of this current term. 2026, there'll be a big gubernatorial election here in South Carolina, and that's going to have a lot of implications, Dylan, not only on the Palmetto State, but as folks begin jockeying for position in 2028, South Carolina first in the nation for Democrats, first in the South for Republicans running for president. Those guys are going to get involved in our elections because they want to collect some chips for when they run for president. But as this race shapes up, we'll pull some of these pictures up. We see our Attorney General Alan Wilson going full MAGA down there in Florida.
Schmoozing in Palm Beach.
At Mar-a-Lago, he's there with some of the Republican luminaries with Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Nancy Mace, the congressman from South Carolina's 1st District, we talked about her earlier in the show, she's making waves, not only with the escaped rhesus monkeys we talked about, and not only making some trips around the state of South Carolina in anticipation of a governor's bid, but Dylan also making some waves in Washington on an issue we've talked about, UFOs.
Yeah, so this has been such a breakneck news week that the government putting on record for the first time that they've communicated with aliens and that they have multiple alien bodies was like the 5th most interesting news story that came out on Tuesday. But yes, the Congress had met multiple times with this UAP, which is like the government word for alien, committee. And they had, I think, 3 or 4 experts on who are former government scientists who kind of whistle blew that there's been this secret program that is not even disclosed to Congress. So it's an executive branch program with no congressional oversight, going back to the separation of powers. This is why we have things like that, so that there's not secret programs with no congressional oversight. But these whistleblowers came forward, and Congress has been interviewing them, and it's been every one of these hearings, it's obvious that there's a very fine line of what they're allowed to say and what they're not allowed to say. But at this hearing, they put on record that they have communicated non-verbally with these non-human intelligent entities. They also released video of these non-human intelligent entities. And I feel like a crackpot for even saying this, but this is what U.S. government experts put on public record in the United States Congress this week. So this is just the world we live in. There are apparently other intelligent life forms which are visiting us here on Earth that our government has been interacting with for decades.
And it's crazy. We get so into the stories we cover, whether it's political, true crime,
Monkeys,
courts, escaped monkeys. But I go through my Facebook messages or my X messages or my Instagram messages, and there's tons of people I know that are like, hey, did you see this UFO hearing? Did you see what, Nancy
I mean,
Mason?
that's huge. Can you think of a bigger news story this century than the fact that we are communicating with other intelligent life forms that are non-human?
We are not alone, Dylan.
We are not.
Wait a minute. Are you an alien?
I am not. Elon Musk might be.
Well, I would argue that artificial intelligence or perhaps alien intelligence may be what that government needs.
They need some regular intelligence first.
Yeah, they certainly haven't had much of that. Well, Dylan, it's a fascinating time to cover politics, man. This last election cycle has been awesome to cover it with you and track all these crazy developments. Any predictions as we look ahead to Donald Trump's impending inauguration? Obviously, these cabinet battles, GOP battles in Washington. Any predictions on how any of this shakes out?
Yeah, there's one thing I'd like to point. Folks, look, if the Senate is holding up his appointees, it looks like he has signaled that he's willing to use recess appointments to get folks in. For folks that don't know, if the House and the Senate are adjourned, and by the way, the president can, if one of the chambers is adjourned, adjourn the other, he can appoint folks for 2-year time periods where they get the same pay and have the same authority as Senate-confirmed appointees. So he has a mechanism, even if the Senate is holding him up, like you say, to get folks in office for 2 years.
Yeah, and again, going back to our discussion earlier, I think you win an election, you should be able to pick who you want.
Well, yeah, and I'm much more open to the balance there if it's a GOP president and it's a Democrat-controlled Senate. But I take your point when it's a GOP Senate and a GOP president. What are
And I
we doing here?
and I say that not being wild about all of the president's picks. I mean, I like most of them. I'm not a fan of Mike Huckabee necessarily. I'm not really a huge Marco Rubio fan. I think he was, in fact, one of the key
I
never
think he was
Trumpers.
throwing a bone to the establishment because if you remember in 2015, every establishment GOP player in this state, at least, was pulling for Rubio hard.
Oh, absolutely. It was he was the last firewall of the Republican establishment.
Well, they may have broken your firewall. You know, FITSNews experienced a very suspicious hack back then, right before the GOP primary. Now, we I don't think have conclusive proof of what happened there, but it was certainly suspicious.
The timing of that hack was suspicious. I remember our tech guy at the time said it was like doing surgery on a car driving down the interstate at 100 miles an hour, trying to fix that hack.
I don't envy him.
Yeah, wild times. Well, Dylan, a lot to look forward to in this coming year in political news, not only in Washington, but here in South Carolina, which once again plays such a pivotal role in shaping the nation's debate. We had Robert Cahaley in here just before the election, a famed national consultant. He pointed out you don't win the presidency without coming here. Ask Donald Trump, ask Joe Biden, ask George W. Bush, ask Barack Obama. I mean, this is a state you got to win, Republican or Democrat, if you want to be your party's nominee.
South Carolina, it promises to continue to play a pivotal role, and if the news in the coming weeks is anything like it was this week, we're going to have plenty to talk about.
Hey, maybe one day we'll get our own press briefing spot. Thanks, Dylan. So I spoke earlier about our media outlets' focus on true crime stories, and certainly the biggest one we've ever covered has been the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga. This is a story which dominated headlines and dominated this show for years, involving one of the most powerful political legal dynasties in the state of South Carolina crumbling in front of our eyes. In the epicenter of that saga, a 56-year-old disgraced lawyer named Alec Murdoch, who ripped off his clients, his friends, his family, law partners, more than $10 million. And when it all came crashing down, according to prosecutors, he took the drastic step of murdering his wife and younger son. Now, this was a story that garnered international headlines. There are documentaries, books, all manner of publicity related to this saga because people simply couldn't fathom why a man would take these actions in those circumstances. The Murdoch story has been at the focus of our coverage for a long time, but in recent months, the story has shifted from what happened, which resulted in guilty verdicts against Alec Murdoch for those murders, to the aftermath, specifically allegations of jury tampering at his trial, which has many believing that Murdoch will receive a new trial. Now, earlier this year, an evidentiary hearing was held in Columbia, South Carolina, where former South Carolina Chief Justice Jean Toll denied Murdoch a new trial, arguing that his attorneys had not met the burden put on them to prove that the jury tampering impacted the verdict. Well, this week, another Murdoch trial saw a major development that has serious implications for that debate and specifically for that standard of jury tampering. I'm going to bring Jen Wood in here. Jen, your research has been instrumental to our coverage of this Murdoch saga, and you have written dozens of articles about not only the case, the murders, the financial crimes associated with them, but in recent months, the legal maneuvering in the aftermath of these tampering allegations. Tell us about the case that we're talking about that could determine whether or not Alec Murdoch gets a new trial.
We are talking about Alex Murdoch's co-conspirator, which alleged co-conspirator now, Russell Laffitte. So Russell Laffitte was the head of Palmetto State Bank in Hampton County, and Palmetto State Bank played an integral role in Alex Murdoch's financial crimes. Russell Laffitte, as CEO of the bank, according to prosecutors, was placed in roles of conservatorship, guardian roles over individuals who Alex represented, and in that role, helped Alex funnel money from settlements to his own pockets.
And Russell Laffitte, in November of 2022, was convicted on multiple counts: wire fraud, bank fraud, all manner of crimes related to his role in Alec Murdoch's fleecing of those folks that you were just referring to, Jen. But this week, those convictions were overturned, and Russell Laffitte was freed from prison and given a new trial on those charges. Jim, what happened? Why did this federal court, appellate court up in Richmond, Virginia, why did they reverse those verdicts and set him free?
So Laffitte was convicted in federal court after a just over a 2-week trial. Dylan Nolan from FITSNews did just fabulous coverage of that trial in Charleston. But this conviction and the appeal came down to juror issues once again. Judge Richard Gergel, there were issues with two of the jurors during deliberations. One needed an antibiotic, and another was experiencing extreme anxiety during deliberations and felt as though she was unable to deliberate any further. So, in the course of those, he dismissed both jurors and replaced them with alternates. The jury went back to deliberate and came back very shortly after with a guilty verdict. And, there are a lot of questions. There were a lot of questions about the process of replacing those jurors and if it violated Russell Laffitte's rights.
Now, Jen, in its ruling here, the U.S. Fourth Circuit used some very important language as it relates to the jury issues involving Russell Laffitte's case. Specifically, it referenced that the government had failed to meet its high burden relating to whether or not these Sixth Amendment issues were harmless to Russell Laffitte. Now, this is very interesting, Jen, because they use the term beyond a reasonable doubt, that the government needed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these jury issues did not impact Russell Laffitte's Sixth Amendment rights. Why is that so important in the Murdoch case, Jen?
I mean, that goes back to former Chief Justice Jean Tolle's very controversial decision to place the burden on the defense in Alex Murdoch's jury tampering hearing. She made that decision ahead of the actual hearing, and it could have gone either way, and it was not well received initially when she made that call. And that's important because, when it comes to issues of a jury being impartial and unbiased, it places the burden on the defense to prove that what happened did not affect the jury's verdict.
Yeah, so this is a significant development because Alec Murdoch, assuming the state of South Carolina does not grant him a new trial, and right now he's 0 for 1 on that, a trial judge, former Chief Justice Jean Toll, has said, no, you don't get a new trial because I don't find that the jury tampering impacted your verdict. I don't know how in the hell she came to that opinion based on the hearing that we watched, where one juror stood up and said not only did the former clerk of court of Colleton County, Becky Hill, tamper with the jury, but that tampering impacted her verdict, which to me is the definition of a Sixth Amendment violation. But nonetheless, Chief Justice Toll concluded that it did not, claimed apparently that they couldn't determine the intent of that tampering. Again, I'm not buying that. But Alec Murdoch has a shot with the state Supreme Court. They could grant him a new trial, but if they don't, Jen, the Fourth Circuit, which just established this standard in the Russell Laffitte case, they're going to be the ones who decided. This bodes very well for Alec Murdoch, does it not, related to his
I think
federal?
Yeah, I think it bodes very, very well. I think the Fourth Circuit set language that indicates they believe that is the burden is on the prosecution to prove that, and that it didn't affect the verdict. And I mean, we've seen the evidence they're going to present. We've seen the decision that Chief Justice Toll made. I mean, she said that it happened. How are they going to prove that it didn't affect the jury's decision?
Indeed. And our media outlet, even before this ruling, earlier this week, FITSNews had a big story up on the 3 ways that former Chief Justice Jean Toll really missed the mark on this Alec Murdoch hearing. Number 1, she confused the federal standard. Number 2, she misinterpreted the state's view on that, again, presumption of prejudice as it relates to jury tampering. And number 3, she ignored the standard she set herself for this trial, which I found to be the most just egregious failure on the part of the former Chief Justice. Jen, do you think the fix was in here?
If you would have asked me that a year ago, I would have said no. But I think yeah. I mean, I think absolutely this verdict is critical to a lot of people, and that's all they're focused on is maintaining that verdict. And we get a lot of heat for talking about this. Every time we talk about it, people are like, you are in the pocket for the defense, blah blah blah. But this is important. Those Sixth Amendment rights are critical to our justice system. I cannot emphasize that enough.
No, you're right. And we've been banging the drum on this for a long time, arguing that whatever you think of Alec Murdoch and now obviously whatever you think of Russell Laffitte, they deserve the right to a fair trial. I mean, bottom line. And I actually wanted to read something because one of the folks who's been kind of on the other side of that debate for a while, attorney Eric Bland, who has been pursuing a number of different cases involving Alec Murdoch on behalf of his victims, who has been, again, coming from the other side on this. Even Eric Bland this week came out with a statement that I think really hit the nail on the head. I wanted to put it up here and read just a bit of it. Even scoundrels like Russell Laffitte are entitled to due process and justice to be appropriately applied to his criminal charges. The reason that our system is the best in the world is that it not only works for the best of us, but it works for the worst of us. Jen, I think that hits the nail on the head, don't you?
Absolutely. And, I don't know how you can say that about Russell Laffitte and not believe it about Alex Murdoch.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, that it is what it is. That fair trial is just so critical.
Well, and Jen, that's my next question. Do you think Eric Bland will be singing the same tune if we do end up back before the Fourth Circuit with Alec Murdoch pushing an appeal and being granted an appeal based on these same grounds?
I mean, I think Eric is a smart attorney, and I think it's hard to say that about Russell Laffitte and not say that about Alex. I mean, it'll be interesting to see, where people's opinions on this go as things evolve. But yeah, he's a smart attorney. It's hard to look past that.
Well, and for folks who are, again, new to these cases and new to these jury issues, just to kind of recap and boil it down, the jury situation in Russell Laffitte's case, there was no tampering. There was an allegation that the judge, during the deliberations, made a bad decision regarding replacing a juror. So again, it was a very different situation from the Murdoch jury tampering allegations, where you have an elected official, a clerk of court, the woman who was in charge of that courtroom, essentially making comments to jurors indicating a presumption of guilt on the part of Alec Murdoch, and having one of those jurors, again, indicate that it influenced their decision. So we're talking about two very different instances here of alleged jury impact that violated Sixth Amendment rights. And again, in the Murdoch case, we've also got an allegation of jury rigging in the Murdoch case. We're still waiting on the state of South Carolina to produce documents related to the investigation into that. A lot of questions as to who could have been potentially involved in that drama. But we're going to continue to do our best as these cases move forward in the court process. For years, these stories have just dominated the headlines. We're going to continue to see them through. And Jen, cannot thank you enough for your tireless work on all of these stories. All right, folks, that is a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. Before we go, though, an update on our investigative reporting from the mountains of western North Carolina. A lot of media outlets have forgotten about this area of the nation in the aftermath of the devastation of Hurricane Helene. There was a lot of initial coverage, but over the last few weeks, a lot of folks have left town. Well, not us. Here's Andy Fancher, who has been on 4 trips to western North Carolina with the very latest on the devastation in Appalachia.
It's an awakening, let's say that. Let's say that.
I miss my family, but I don't want to leave anybody.
When Hurricane Helene stalled over western North Carolina on September 27th, her victims were pulverized by the fragments of a mountain range once hailed as a haven for surviving natural crises. Record-breaking winds sent fields of timber soaring through a toxic deluge. propelled and distanced by a pop-up network of roaring rapids, upended homes, and communities beyond recognition. Littering these settlements were all manner of detritus, including human remains.
I personally saw somebody hanging in a tree about 20 feet above the ground.
Trey O'Hara, a born-again carpenter from Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, claims to have responded to Appalachia's distress call within hours of Helene's dissipation over eastern Tennessee. He furthermore claims to have laid eyes on numerous fatalities in Buckham County, North Carolina, despite mainstream media's incessant pushback to any such statement.
I looked over, then there's stacks chest high of body bags, 45, maybe even 50 feet long. And so just that alone, that'd be more than what they're reporting right there.
One of many eyewitness testimonies backed by photographs of storm-related fatalities, their personal belongings, and chain of custody forums provided by a local funeral home.
I really think it's going to be a long time before it's okay.
Angel Marks, a retired kindergarten teacher from Vass, North Carolina, claims to have encountered similar horrors while restoring electricity to displaced survivors. An out-of-pocket effort that hasn't come without difficulty from the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
FEMA moved in, wanted to know could we provide generators for their people, and shortly after we told them no, we were moved. So we're at Ledger Fire Department now.
The makeshift post in Bakersville, where Marks and her husband have coordinated the delivery of at least 250 generators with the help of volunteers like O'Hara.
Here I'm also helping out, and that is to hook up the generators to get power back to the houses that don't have power. And every day I go out, and it's amazing how much damage was done.
Breathtaking horror that has led O'Hara from the spoils of Fairview to the remnants of Irwin. Equipped with nothing more than a tool belt, tenacity, and a higher calling.
This is my first time here, and man, I am in awe.
Seen here during a service call in Spruce Pine, a tiny town known as America's sole source of high-purity quartz, a crystalline mineral vital to the world's production of semiconductors and solar panels.
You know, it may be tragedy, but we're counting the blessing that came along with it.
And a second home to 68-year-old Chip Taff, a mountaineer whose meter-based power was restored by O'Hara after 28 days on a gas-powered generator.
People without power, of course, have no heat.
Thank you so much. Yes, sir.
It snowed here Wednesday. They were freezing. All of it, all around, is devastating. And it's just more than somebody could ever imagine.
I mean, whose ears does it got to hit before somebody decides to do something different? You know, it's gonna be the right set of ears sooner or later. You know, all we got to do is keep truth telling.
For FITSNews.com, I'm Andrew Fancher.
Count on FITSNews to continue covering the aftermath of this apocalypse as Andy is making yet another trip to Western North Carolina in the very near future. Keep it tuned to FITSNews for the latest on that. Thank you again for tuning in, and thank all of you who subscribe to FITSNews.com. It's your subscription that helps us hold folks accountable, speak truth to power, and insist on accountability on all the stories we cover. We'll catch you next time on The Week in Review.